All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of our webinar series. Today we'll be talking about layouting in Vaadin and how to apply different kind of techniques to lay out your Vaadin applications. My name is Peter, and I'm here today with my colleague Miki.
Hello.
So let's first start by looking at our agenda today. We'll talk generally about the layout structure, what you can do with Vaadin layouts, how you should be using these layouts, what kind of mechanisms there are to compose your structures. Then we'll talk about the most commonly used mechanisms like spacing and margin, as well as with the expand ratios, which are the fundamental part of Vaadin vertical and horizontal layouting. We will also discuss the sizing and component alignment inside the free space of layouts and discuss how you can, for example, apply your own styles on other components and layouts as well. Then at the end, we'll also cover the basics of other component containers which are not directly layouts but still components which can hold other child components. And since Vaadin 7.3 was recently released with the new Valo theme, we will also cover the responsive way of creating Vaadin layouts with the CSS layout together with Valo theme approach. All right, but let's get started with the actual basic layout structure of Vaadin. As all of you probably are aware, the way how you build Vaadin UIs, Vaadin layouts, is built around the idea of having composable containers or composable components, in a sense where different components are put into some parent component. So this is quite fundamental difference from example Swing or other mechanisms of building desktop-based applications. As everything in Vaadin is a component, also the component containers and layouts are components as well. And component container is the base structure and the starting point for actually composing your own UI. So we'll cover the component containers in more detail at the end of the presentation, but we'll start by discussing the general layouts and what, for example, the layout interface brings on top of the traditional component containers. So Miki will show you from the Vaadin sampler the basic layouts that are available with Vaadin core distribution.
Yes, what you can see here on the screen is the Vaadin sampler available at demo.vaadin.com/sampler. And in the section user interface layout, you can see the overview of all the layouts that we are going to talk about today. So maybe we should start with the CSS layout.
Yeah. So without going into too technical details, the actual structure, how things have been implemented with Vaadin, start from the component container and layout interfaces, but quite soon after that we reach the abstract component container and abstract layout, abstract classes, which define all the basic functionality that is then extended by all the traditional Vaadin layouts. And out of these, the CSS layout is the first and the most simple one to extend the abstract layout.
Yes, let's take a look at that. So let's navigate in a sampler to a CSS layout demo page. Here you can see that the CSS layout is the simplest layout in Vaadin in terms of functionality. The only thing it does is it just floats the components from left to right and top to bottom and delegates everything else to the CSS files. So there is nothing you can configure about this layout by default. You can see it also in the sampler that there are absolutely no settings related to the components. So that's the CSS layout in its most general form.
Yeah.
Let's move on to
about the CSS layout. Actually, still, if you consider, for example, the rendering performance, we could say that CSS layout is the most performative of the layouts, as it doesn't really do any calculations and rely.
Yes, everything
on
is left
browser.
to the CSS file in the browser. So the Vaadin application doesn't do anything except just rendering the components.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, in the Valo theme and the responsive design, which we'll cover at the end of the session, most of that stuff is based on CSS layout, as it's very flexible on CSS ways. All right, another thing that we'll, of course, mention to you is the concept of absolute layout, which is also one of the Vaadin core layouts, and it's been with the framework for quite a long time. Absolute layout is quite close, as the name says, a layout that allows the developers to position the components absolutely by giving a CSS-like syntax where you define the position of the component relative to the actual layout. So looking at that from the sampler, will give you some idea on what the component actually looks like.
Yes, when you add the components to the absolute layout, you can specify with a CSS-like syntax their position, for example, top and left, top and right, or bottom. You can specify the values in absolute measurements like pixels, or you can make it with percentages. Percentages, of course, mean that while you resize the available space, the component moves slightly. You can also specify width and height of a component that will appear in the absolute layout. The disadvantage of this solution, or advantage as some of you might see it, is that the positions and widths and heights are rendered as an inline style of a corresponding HTML element, which means it's really difficult to change it. So this is if you want to absolutely position your component, as the name says, you should use absolute layout.
Yeah, so in a way we could say that the use case for absolute layout is usually not that frequent. So it's more like in cases where you have some sort of difficulties, for example, to structure the application in some other manner, and I don't know, maybe we should even say that, or disencourage you from using absolute layout. So at least I can't recall that we'd be using that with too many applications, as it of course creates problems with, for example, changing resolutions, and is not very flexible if you, for example, consider UIs that should work also with the mobile devices as well as with just desktop environment.
Yes, but it's there, and if your use case fits it, then you probably want to use it.
Of course. Another component that is, or layout that is, let's say, more commonly used is the grid layout. The grid layout is a layout that allows you also, as the name says, use a grid as the starting point of laying out your components with certain special features that allow you to have more flexibility in the actual component alignments. Yes,
a grid, well, as the name says, arranges the components in a tabular form. So you can specify a number of columns and a number of rows, and then you just add components to it. What is important and interesting feature of grid layout is that it is possible to merge cells. So you can specify that one component can take more than one row or more than one column, and the component or the layout will not allow you to overlap that with any content. So you will get an exception when you try to add a component to a cell that is already taken by something.
What about if you add more components to the grid that there are, for example, available rows? So isn't it so that adding a component will actually give you a new row?
Yes,
if needed?
yes. When you already have, like in this case where you see on the screen, if you have 6 components and you add a 7th one, then the grid layout will create a new row here at the bottom, and the component will be placed in a first available cell. Yeah.
So the number of the columns is
fixed.
fixed, but the number of rows can vary.
Yes.
All right. Regarding grid layout, I think the performance on the rendering part, the rendering performance isn't one of the best either. So grid layout, at least if used in a nested manner where you have grid layouts inside grid cells of a parent grid layout that might cause you some sluggish UI behavior. So it's also maybe advisable to avoid using nested grid layouts. Or if that is needed, then maybe composing the similar kind of structure with CSS layout is more preferable.
Yes, and one other thing is that the positions of the components are calculated on the server side and rendered as the inline style of a div element, meaning that it's really hard to reposition them with CSS, and you should keep that in mind while using grid layout.
Yeah. Alrighty. So these three layouts cover everything that there is in the abstract layout inherited classes. Maybe more common layouts, or let's say the most common layouts that come with Vaadin, are vertical and horizontal layout, and they are both extended from the abstract ordered layout. So abstract ordered layout provides you different kind of mechanisms that are originally inherited all the way from the sub-interfaces of layout interface and give you the ability to control positioning components in vertical or horizontal manner.
Yes, and these are, as you already said, probably the most commonly used layouts in Vaadin, and they work very well in their job of aligning the components. So when you, for example, want to just have three buttons one next to another, then you are better using a horizontal layout rather than specifying their position with CSS. What these layouts both do, they allow you to specify a margin around them, meaning that there is some extra space around the whole layout. And then you can also specify spacing, which means that the components will have tiny space between them, and they will not look as clogged as they are. So by default, you can see here that each component has exactly the same amount of space, and you can just add that extra little space. And Peter will show you the code now, how you can actually achieve this.
Yeah, so the margin and spacing in general is something that is only provided by the abstract ordered layout concept, and with very simple API, just by saying set spacing or set margin with the Boolean flag will enable you the mentioned margin and spacing as is. So I think that the benefit of this approach is that on the framework level and on the theme level, it is guaranteed that all the margins and spacings have similar sizes everywhere. And for example, composing your layouts with nested vertical and horizontal layout is relatively easy, as they sort of follow the intuitive box model quite closely.
Yes.
So from maybe the framework point of view, we would again say that vertical layout and horizontal layout are all the way still today the most common and most used layouts in Vaadin. And of course, even though there are other options as well, we of course intend that these would also in the future be the real core layouts of the whole Vaadin framework.
Yes. As you said, horizontal and vertical layout operate on something called the box model. So you can see here in the sampler that each component is rendered inside a box of equal size. So by default, each component is given exactly the same amount of space for it to show. We can modify this by something called expand ratio. So we can, for example, tell the first component to take 3 times as much space as the other one. And then you can see that when we're resizing that the box for component 1 grows 3 times as fast as the box for the other one, and the last component is by default just given the minimum amount of space that it's available to it.
Yeah, so regarding the expand ratios, you could almost say that maybe one common use case is that in your layout you want one component to take all the available space and then other components inside the layout just to take the space that is really required by them. So usage of expand ratio just by providing the expand ratio for one component is probably the easiest way to achieve this result, as the default expand ratio for all the other components is by default 0.
Yes.
Yeah. So a bit closer look into the concept of expand ratio and what it actually means, as this is one of the, I would say, key point of Vaadin layouting when building layout and UI structure with vertical and horizontal layout. Normally, if you consider adding components into your UI, you might, for example, want to avoid scrollable UI. So in a sense that the base structure of the whole UI remains as is, and if there are some scrolling parts, they are, for example, bordered with some panels. In our example, our UI would have the base layout of the mentioned vertical layout here with the vertical layout variable name, and it's been given the full size, which means that it takes 100% width and height of its parent component. And if we say that vertical layout in this case is the content of our UI, then these 100% are calculated basically from the browser window size. If we add now, let's say, 2 CSS layouts into our vertical layout, which is the UI content, and define that both of these layouts should take 100% of the size, what does it actually mean to say that 100% of the parent size? In this case, if you look at it, you can, for example, think that the vertical layout here is now the 100% times 100% size, and by default, the ordered layouts actually distribute the space evenly for their child components. So when adding 2 CSS layouts into our vertical layout, or 2 components for that matter, whatever they are, the distributed size for them is by default even, meaning that they both get 50% of the vertical space. And when in our code example we said that both child layouts should take 100% of the size, it actually means that they take 100% of the boxes which are surrounded with the red rectangle here. So this is, from the sizing point of view, one of the crucial steps to understand from Vaadin layouting, that the size of the component, when defined as a relative size, is always relative to the actual parent component size. And when, for example, using the ordered layouts, the defined size is more to the point for the space that is reserved for the actual component. So this is something that especially new Vaadin developers can get a little bit mixed up at first. And as we were talking about the expand ratios, we can, for example, now define that our vertical layout, which is now the root component for these 2 mentioned CSS layouts, should actually adjust the available space with 1:4 ratio. So when defining, for example, expand ratio for 1 to be 1 for the first layout and 4 to be second layout, the end result is actually so that we have 20% reserved for the first layout and remaining 80% for the second layout. And of course, it's important to realize here that this extra space is available only because we made the parent vertical layout to have 100% size. Otherwise, the vertical layout wouldn't normally, or it would only normally scale according to the available parent child components, but as we've specified now the height to be 100%, only then we can really apply the expand ratios. And here again, when we notice that the layout 2 is now also taking the whole size of its own red rectangle bordered box, it means that this 100% is calculated from the size that the parent vertical layout has given to it. Wow, that was a big explanation. Is there something from the sampler that you want to show regarding the sizing and expand ratios?
Yes, we can show the expand ratios and set size full. So we can modify this example to contain numbers that you have had in your slides. So the first box is 4 times big as the second one, and then we will also make the third component to expand exactly the same here as the second one. Mm-hmm. So this is, as you already know now, this is just the box that takes that resizes and takes the space. And you may ask, why isn't the component resized to fit the box? Well, it's because it has a fixed dimensions. So if we make it 100% size, then you can suddenly see that it occupies the whole space.
Yeah. So this 100% is from the actual area that is reserved for the component.
Yes, it's not the total size of the layout, it's not the total size of the browser, it's just the size of the box. And the box is calculated according to expand ratios that we set to it.
Exactly. Okay. What would then happen if we, for example, used fixed pixel sizes for the child components, and for example for the child one here that is now of size 100%, if we define that it's, for example, 1000 pixels wide, what would be the behavior?
I would expect that the
Since
layout would take minimum of 1000 pixels and then add some extra to it.
So probably if the parent layout, of course, is 100% on both dimensions, then it most likely will keep that size, and then the child component will simply either overlap from it or get clipped on the border.
Yes, that's the most expectable outcome, I would say.
Yeah, all right.
Okay,
well, moving on to the actual sizing of components and layouts in general. So as you already saw, the full size can be defined with setSizeFull method call, but you can also specify the width and height of the components with pixel values. So you can, in this example, for example, give the component width to be 30 pixels, and that would result as the HTML div element having an inline width of 30 pixels. When you set the size full, the outcome will of course be the corresponding inline style of width and height both being 100% size. And this is now of course layout dependent, so that, as we explained with the box model, the 100% is always calculated from the actual parent component area.
Yes, and these values are again rendered as inline styles, meaning it's very difficult to change them with the CSS.
Yeah, so that's of course something to keep in mind, that if you specify the component sizes with the server-side API, then overriding those with CSS values becomes much more difficult and is not encouraged. So either define the sizes, especially for CSS layouts, on CSS style sheet, but then again for ordered layouts it's better to define them with the server-side API, as that's what they are really meant for. Then if you want to remove the defined size on the server side, you can call component setSizeUndefined, which is effectively the same as setSizeFull, but just to the other direction, so it will remove the size. And Vaadin 7.3 actually added feature where you can set the width and height as undefined separately.
Yes, and undefined means that the information about the width or height is just removed from the corresponding div element, which means that if you have it set in the CSS file, then of course it will work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's pretty close as it is, exactly. Another thing is that with older versions of Vaadin, you might have, for example, used the set width to be -1 or set height to be -1. So this is mainly just an API cleanup or fix to make it more intuitive to define the sizes. Then a few words about the component alignment, which is also very important part regarding ordered layouts in general. With the alignment and with our previous example, we can, for example, think that when adding a component, for example a button, into a layout that is taking 100% on both dimensions, the space reserved for the component is actually the whole layout, meaning that the button size is just as it is undefined by default, meaning that it's actually the size of the button caption. So there is a lot of free space available inside the layout as it's really taking the full size on both dimensions, meaning that this free space is actually indicated by the red rectangle inside the component, which is called the component area or component slot. And within this space, you can, with the alignment, move the component into the area of your liking using the set alignment or set component alignment method with the alignment enum value. And by default, you get 9 control points over which you can move the component. So if you, for example, move it to middle right, the button would move within its parent layout's free space to the middle right. And keep in mind that this functionality is only available with the ordered layouts, meaning the vertical and horizontal layout. And also, if you consider the size of the parent layout, these control points can also be overlapping, meaning that if, for example, we would only have set the width of the parent layout to be 100%, but the height would be undefined, then the height of the parent layout would actually be the height of the button, meaning that all the adjacent control points horizontally would actually overlap, meaning that you would only be able to set the alignment from left to middle to right, but not actually on the vertical position.
Yeah. And the same case when you have the size of the button bigger, that means that the position of the button can overlap over some points that you could align the button to.
Yeah, exactly. So just a few pointers to keep in mind.
Yes, let's move on to styling with CSS. We have already said a couple of times here that changing something with CSS might be difficult, but how do we actually refer to components from the CSS file? So each Vaadin component has a way of doing that, and this is done through style names. And there is a method called add style name. Of course, there is a corresponding remove method as well. When you do this method call, so for a component you add a style name named marked, then the corresponding HTML element will have that style name as a class. Of course, if there are more style names, then they will be all listed there with space separated values. And then this is very easy to reference from CSS. We just use a class selector, so .marked, and then we put the styling issues. One thing we can encourage here is that the style names that you use should be informative. So they should mean something that when you browse the code or browse the CSS, then you can get the meaning of that particular style name more easy than not.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we also promised that we would a little bit talk about other component containers than just the ordered layouts or layouts that are extended from the abstract layout. These are, for example, tab sheet and accordion, or different kind of split panels extended from the abstract split panel class. So vertical and horizontal split panel. If there are still users of Vaadin 6, with Vaadin 6 you had just one split panel component for which you had to specify the actual split orientation, but with Vaadin 7 they've been separated into 2 different components altogether. Horizontal and vertical split panels are basically simple panel components that enable scrolling, but also they enable you to, from the UI point of view, with, for example, drag and drop, to define the size of the space that is reserved for the child components inside the panels.
Yes, and in cases of both split panels, you can also lock the split, meaning that it's impossible to drag it from the browser. So you can specify it programmatically to be of some value, and then you can just lock it and disable the user to do it. And what is, I think, the most important thing with the horizontal and vertical split panels is that they can only have two components in them.
Yeah, first and second.
First and second, yes. Yeah. So it's impossible to add more components. Of course, each of those two components can be a component container that contains other components in turns, but on a general level, it's only these. And we can also show you how accordion and tab sheet look like. They are both very similar. Accordion just arranges components in tabs one below the other and offers lots of extra functionality when it comes to tabs. So tabs can be enabled, visible, closable. They can have their own caption, icons, and the like. And the same goes for a tab sheet, but this time we will have the components arranged one next to another.
Yeah.
So
in a horizontal way.
In a horizontal way, yes.
And actually one nice feature regarding tab sheet is that if the available space for the tab sheet is smaller than the number of tabs, it will actually give you automatically the little buttons which you can use to...
Yes, this handy area here that you can
around.
See on the screen, yes.
Exactly. Great. So just keep in mind that accordion, tab sheet and split panels are not really layouts. They are something that is extended from the component container, but let's say that they have their own purpose, their own use cases, but they are not, strictly speaking, layouts. And for example, expand ratios and these, as we already discussed, won't be directly applicable to the mentioned components. Yes. But as Miki already said, you can of course use other layouts as the content of the tabs or accordion sheets or the split panel component areas. Great. Something other from also, which was already part of Vaadin 6 and previous versions of the framework, was the custom layout, which is of course still supported. With the custom layout,
yes,
you define your own HTML structure.
Yes, it's the web-based layouting, as you can call it. So each custom layout instance should have a corresponding HTML file in which you use placeholders for components. So you can see them here.
Yeah, the location attribute.
The location attribute is a unique identifier across the whole HTML file, and then in the code you just add components, and whenever you add a component, you specify in which location it should be rendered.
Yeah. And from the implementation point of view, the final resulting HTML won't, of course, contain those location attributes.
Of course, they will be replaced. Those divs will be replaced with a component.
Yeah.
But it's a way of layouting the application actually, with using some old-fashioned HTML files.
Yeah. Then to the bit more interesting part, which is becoming really trendy with, for example, with different JavaScript frameworks in the world around today. And responsive layout and responsive design is something that also Vaadin 7 and now especially Vaadin 7.3 tries to address with the new Valo theme and an extension that used to be Vaadin add-on, but since Vaadin 7.2 built into the actual Vaadin core and Vaadin distribution. With responsive layouts, we mean a structure which is able to change the CSS class identifiers, the HTML class attributes according to the actual width range, or then just directly changing the properties of certain class attribute according to defined width range, or you can also specify responsive layouts on the height-wise manner. Anyway, looking at this example here, we see traditional widescreen application with some menu and some content on the right-hand side. Resizing this application into much smaller resolution with responsive layouting enabled from Vaadin 7.3 would actually address the application in such a way that the menu, for example, gets reconstructed so that the captions might be removed and only icons used with the menu items, and then also the content of the visible application content area would get differently arranged. So this is something that you might have already been able to do with just pure CSS layout before Vaadin 7.3, as it by default aligns the components from left to right according to the available space, but with responsive extension, this kind of alignment is now also much more easy to do. If we went on from this and again lowered the resolution, or for example used the application with let's say smartphones, we might be able to show just the menu items of our application if so wanted, or even shrink the menu into the actual hamburger icon, which then could pop up from there. Let's take a look at this from the actual Valo demo theme site, which quite nicely shows you the responsive design.
Yes, it showcases all the nice features of the Valo theme, which is the new theme in Vaadin 7.3, and the whole demo is built on responsive layouts. So in its general form, when you have a full size or almost full size of the screen available, you can see the menu clearly to the left and then the contents to the right. And as we start resizing and the space shrinks, at some point you can see that the menu is now taking way less space. So all the menu items have been compacted and they do not take that much space. And if we go even further from here, if we replace it, then you can see that the menu is now completely gone and is replaced with the button here. So you can see the menu from the overlay when you press the button. And how we do it with the code is very simple.
Yeah, so as we mentioned at the beginning, CSS layouts and whole CSS based design is the key on responsive layouting, and Valo theme supports this especially through CSS layouts. So also, as we mentioned about the responsive extension that used to be an add-on in Vaadin, now part of the core, is something that you should be using with this, so that you define first some style name for your CSS layout, maybe set the size to be full, and then make the layout responsive by using the static make responsive method from the responsive class. What this allows you to do is on the CSS file to use media query like width and height ranges, which allow you to change the content of the, or let's say the properties of the responsive class identifier according to the current size of the browser window. So with this you could actually make your application behave in a nice manner with, let's say, mobile devices, tablet devices, and or desktop systems. So for example, the widest range, which is here starting from 501 pixels, is not limited from the top, meaning that however wide your resolution is, it will still always use the actual widest option, whereas the smallest range is from 0 to 300 pixels.
Yes, and of course this is just an example, so you can specify your own ranges, and you can have even more than 3.
Yeah, the number is not limited. And also the height range is supported as well if needed. I suppose most of the use cases is with the width range, but
most of them, yes.
But height is of course supported as well. Is there anything else we want to mention from the responsive design, responsive structure?
I don't think so. I think that was pretty big overview already.
Yeah. So anyway, we can say that Vaadin comes with many different kind of layouts, component containers, and the ordered layouts are the ones that support the expand ratios, alignments, and they have these little bit special ways of, for example, saying that the size of child component is always relative to the actual area reserved for the component. And we concluded by saying that responsive is something that is used mainly with the CSS layout and CSS properties in general. On our behalf, thank you for watching. It was great to have you. And actually, as a last pointer, there is a Vaadin Pro Tools offer for very limited time for all those who signed up for our webinar. You will receive an email with a special offer code that discounts you 3 months from 1 year subscription on Vaadin Charge, TouchKit and TestBench. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.